everyone, me again. Happy New Year 2022. We are going to start this new year off with an episode on something that's been around for several hundred years, and that is corsets. And there are different variations of corsets. We should begin by saying how, if you look at the silhouette of fashion over the centuries, but decades as well, underpinnings were a very important part of how things looked on the outside. And Christian Dior actually was known to say, without foundations, there is no fashion. And that was obviously very apparent in the 1947 when he dropped the new look and became like an overnight sensation and a big deal. But we're going to actually talk about things that go back further. I don't have examples that go beyond 1820, 1830, but I'm very excited that I actually have a couple of pieces from that time period. And we're also going to talk about parts of corsets and girdles. I should mention that there's some pretty wonderful websites that cover the area of foundations, corsets, and lingerie. One of them is called Dreamstress, like seamstress, but Dreamstress. And the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco has a great kind of timeline of corsetry. But I'm going to begin by saying that there are other things that totally influence fashion. For example, Swiss waists. Now, that is something that was meant to be worn on the outside. And if you look at historic images like from John Singer Sargent, for example, he did a portrait of Mrs. Wilton Phipps in 1884. So Swiss waists and corselets didn't have any metal parts to it at all. Most of the things were hand sewn. The eyelets were hand sewn, and sometimes they used buttons. But those were specifically meant to be worn on the outside. They were really popular in the 1860s, and what was great about them was they were worn by pretty much everyone from royalty down to quote-unquote common folk. And they stayed in popularity and use for probably about 30 years through the 1890s. They did make variations of the Swiss waist with shoulder straps. So corselets were really popular towards the latter part of the 19th century, and oftentimes they were referred to as corselet belt. And they literally were a belt to accentuate the waist and to make the bust and the hips seem, give you that incredible silhouette. And you can see them worn pretty much through 1915. So, like everything in fashion, they fell out of fashion pretty much towards the late teens. But interestingly enough, they came back in the 30s. A lot of the dresses you'll see have that corselet midriff, like a cummerbund almost. So what makes the Swiss waist and the corselet different than a corset? It's pretty much all in the detail. Corsets are, the ones that I'm talking about are from like the 1860s. But before we get into corsets, I actually want to show you the two pieces that we have that are from the 1820s to 1830s. They are corded. This is a corded corset. And some people call them stays, but this one is not a stay because it doesn't have any place for the actual boning. What's beautiful about this is it has bone eyelets, and all of these, what they look like raised, and they are raised, are corded details. And the front has this beautiful crisscross detail. It's all on cotton. It's a double cotton so that obviously the cord can go in for the cording detail. And I actually have two examples of these 1820s to 1830s corded corsets. And I'm hoping that these go into a museum because they're pretty special. Imagine 200 years old. And then, let's see, as we move along, I want to talk about stays because I mentioned them. They were, I'm going to read from my notes, that it was a term used for the fully boned laced bodice worn under clothes from the late 16th or early 17th century. When you look at underpinnings, you'll see stays along with stomachers, which was shown on the outside and kind of gave a finished look. But in my reading, which just kind of really blew me away, supporting the body not only was for posture and silhouette, but also connoted whether you were a person of good repute. I'm so glad we don't have to do that these days. Stays were literally a symbol of a woman's uprightness and virtue. So along with stays, there's a thing called jumps, which I did not know about, and they were softer and significantly less boned, and sometimes completely unboned, and they provided some bust support but didn't shape the body into like an elegant cone shape, which is what the silhouette was of that time period. I want to actually show you something. I bought this like 30 years ago in France at the incredible museum next to the Louvre, and it is actually a diagram of fashion silhouettes. On the other side, it actually goes back even further than 1830. And you can see that the bodice, which is what we're really focusing on, that silhouette has really changed dramatically over the almost 200 or 150 years that's pictured in here. So when you flip-flop through the decades and you see how corsets are used, I mean, throughout like the last 30 years, you look at Madonna with Gaultier, as recently as Lizzo, and a lot of the contemporary musical stars are using corsets as part of their wardrobe. But very similar to the 1830s, 1820s, 30s corded corset that I showed you is this Gary Graham bodice that is also corded. It's hook and eye in the front with this wonderful gusset that gives freedom in the hip area. And a lot of corsets were made by Vivienne Westwood, bodices that were done, I mean, it's all over the place. Anyway, I want to show you also, like this, for example, is a Westwood, and she has stays in the back, and it's very stiff in the front. It has radiating boning in the bodice, in the front part, and it's this beautiful stenciled velvet with a zip back. And this is part of her portrait collection. And Westwood used corsets a lot. We have this three-piece ensemble, which is this very luscious oyster silk satin bustier skirt and jacket. And you can see it draws inspiration from just the construction of a stomacher and a corset. And then we'll get into the later pieces, but I want to point out Gaultier's iconic corseted torpedo top. And this is an unusual dress because it has, I would call these bat sleeves or lantern sleeves. This is a really iconic silhouette by Gaultier, and you can see it has the corsets with the bones and the torpedo concentric circle in the bra area, variation of what he created for Madonna. And on this side, we have a beautiful lace up. This lacing is very typical of the back of corsets, and this piece is Christian Lacroix. Another designer that utilizes corsets a lot in his design is Terry Mugler. And this is the back of a book that was produced by a gentleman who actually worked with him for over 2 decades, and he photographed almost all of his collection. So if you're interested in seeing how corsets are integrated in today's fashion and how relevant it still is, it's a good book to see if you can find. Meanwhile, I don't want to go without pointing out this amazing ribbon corset, probably from about 1905. It's a silk ribbon, and it has the busk in the front for closure and the lacing in the back. And back in the 80s, when I was pretty new business, I had the good fortune of meeting a gentleman by the name of Geoffrey Duffield, who bought a company from 1830 called Button Boot and Spatterdash in London, or in England. And he offered me the opportunity to carry his corsets and waist cinchers in my store exclusively in the United States, and I did for several years. He gave me the information that it took him so many times, attempts of hundreds of yards of ribbon that was wasted in trying to recreate this particular corset waist cincher, because it has to be done exactly right on an angle. And so my appreciation for this is much bigger than most people, because I have the inside information on how difficult it is to make. This is also, it's like a corselet waist cincher, and it's a little bit newer. I actually don't know how to date this. I would say it's probably 1930s. And it's this beautiful silk jacquard lined in cotton with the lacing in the back again and the busk in the front. So you can see how this is really very much influenced by this piece, that time period. On the table we also have something that brings us a little bit closer to the 1950s and 60s. I love this box because it's very femme fatale, very, in a way, Dita Von Teese. And we do have some examples of lingerie that has built-in boning to give the body support. So much of the corset and all the things going through are really meant to define the shape of the body, but also give support. And as we get closer to the 21st century, you'll see many of these pieces, including what is called a Merry Widow, which was invented or brought into the world by Maidenform, was designed in 1952, and it was a trademark of the Maidenform company, and they designed it for Lana Turner's role in a 1952 movie of the same name. So this is with the boning going all the way down almost to where the garters are. This is a kind of a variation on the theme, but the construction is super cool. It's got an exposed, a peekaboo midriff, and it's a mixture of elastic, stretch elastic, kind of a net with satin, and it's a combination. But you'll see a lot of these things have really kind of intricate construction, and these were totally made to support the waist but also to bring in the hips. And last but not least is this pink girdle that actually Melanie Griffith wore this in Mulholland Falls. There was a time when I used to rent my clothes for film and television production. So other things I want to mention, you know, silhouette is so important in fashion, and you think of all the trials and tribulations that women went to over several hundred years to acquire the silhouette of the time and the status quo. Otherwise, it would pretty much point you out as a person either of no money or of ill repute. And I think that we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. So on that note, I think we will wrap it up for now. And if you like this episode, please give us a thumbs up. If you have any comments or suggestions, some of these items will be available on our website to purchase. And if you have any insight into any of these pieces, I'd love to hear from you as well. So I do read your comments, and I appreciate your interest. So that's it for now. Thanks very much. Bye.